The first time Eva Collins walked into the town of Harrow Creek, she was already lying. Not with her words. Eva Collins was not a woman who traded in falsehoods. She was lying with her body, with every careful, measured step she placed upon the sun-cracked earth of the main thoroughfare, forcing her left foot to land with a confidence it no longer possessed, forcing her spine to remain upright when every instinct in her screamed to lean against the nearest post and let the pain have its way with her. She was lying with her chin lifted high against the Nevada sky. She was lying with her eyes, scanning the storefronts of this dusty, half-built town as though she had not just endured 4 days on a rattling stagecoach with a left leg that had not worked properly since the accident outside of Sacramento 3 years prior. The year was 1874, and Harrow Creek was the kind of town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It had a saloon, naturally. It had a general store with crooked shutters, a blacksmith shop that smelled of hot iron and horse sweat, a small schoolhouse at the edge of town that doubled as a church on Sundays, and a post office no bigger than a broom closet. It had a single hotel of questionable cleanliness called the Dusty Anchor, and it had a land office where men came to stake their claims on the surrounding territory. It was growing, Harrow Creek, in that raw and uncertain way that western towns grew, like something pressing up through hard soil and not yet sure of its own shape. Eva had come because of the advertisement. She had clipped it from a newspaper in Sacramento 3 weeks before her departure, carefully folding it into the small leather purse she kept close to her chest. The advertisement had read, "Cook and housekeeper wanted for a working cattle ranch, 12 miles outside Harrow Creek, Nevada territory. Modest wage, room and board included. Inquire at the Harrow Creek land office. References preferred." It had not mentioned anything that would disqualify her. It had not mentioned anything at all about how a person was required to walk. She had written a letter first, detailing her experience in her neat, school-learned hand. She could cook. She could keep a house. She had done both for the boarding house in Sacramento, where she had lived since the accident took her position as a seamstress, and briefly, her freedom of movement along with it. The wagon that had struck her on that ordinary Tuesday morning had shattered the bones of her lower left leg, and though the surgeon had done his best, the bones had not healed cleanly. The result was a shortening, a subtle misalignment that she had learned to manage and minimize and, above all else, to conceal, because she had discovered in those years after the accident that the moment people saw the limp, they saw nothing else. They saw liability. They saw someone to be pitied or accommodated or, worst of all, turned away from a position because of concern that she could not manage the work. She could manage the work. She had been managing the work her whole life. The letter she received in response had been brief and businesslike, written in a hand that sprawled across the page with impatient energy. The ranch was called the Red Cedar. The owner needed someone reliable who could start immediately. The wage was $12 a month with a room in the ranch house. If she was interested, she should present herself at the land office in Harrow Creek on the 3rd Monday of September, and arrangements would be made from there. She had presented herself. She had arranged for her single trunk to be deposited at the Dusty Anchor while she walked the length of the main street to find the land office, and she had done so with every ounce of discipline she possessed, willing her left leg to behave, to fall into the rhythm she had practiced, to not betray her on this first and most important day. The land office was a narrow building wedged between the general store and a small assay office, and when Eva pushed open the door, a small bell above it chimed. Inside, behind a scarred wooden counter, sat a round-faced man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who introduced himself as Mr. Hobbs, the land agent. He confirmed her appointment and told her, with a small smile that contained more apology than welcome, that Mr. Keating had been held up at the ranch but would be along shortly. Eva sat in one of the hard-backed chairs against the wall and breathed carefully and waited. She heard him before she saw him. She heard the sound of boots on the boardwalk outside, a long, unhurried stride, And then the door opened and Clyde Keating walked in and took up rather more space than Eva had expected a man to take up in a room that size. He was tall, genuinely tall, with the kind of lean, worked-in build that came from years of physical labor rather than any particular effort toward it. His hair was dark beneath the brim of a battered hat, and his jaw carried 2 or 3 days of stubble, and his eyes, when they landed on Eva, were an unusual shade of hazel, somewhere between green and gold, clear and steady and taking in a great deal more than they immediately revealed. He was perhaps 28, 29 at most, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of a man entirely comfortable in his own body and entirely at ease in this territory. He pulled off his hat when he saw her, and that small courtesy softened something in Eva's chest before she could prevent it. "Miss Collins," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, carrying a slight drawl that placed him somewhere in the Texas corridor of his origins. "That is correct," Eva said, and stood, and shook his hand with the firm grip her father had always told her was a woman's best first impression. He introduced himself as Clyde Keating, owner of the Red Cedar Ranch, and he sat across from her in the remaining hard-backed chair because Mr. Hobbs, apparently understanding that this was a conversation rather than a transaction, had retreated to the back room. Clyde asked her questions about her experience, about cooking for large numbers of men, about whether she could handle the isolation, about her health, and at that word, health, Eva felt the familiar small tightening in her chest, the anticipatory bracing for the follow-up that would undo her. But his follow-up was simply about whether she was accustomed to hard winters, and she exhaled carefully and told him that she was adaptable. He studied her for a moment with those hazel eyes, and something moved through them that she could not quite name, and then he extended his hand again and said, "You are hired, Miss Collins, if you will take the position." She took it immediately. He had a wagon waiting on the street outside, and he helped her up onto the seat without ceremony or fuss, and she managed the step with practiced grace, and they set out along the packed dirt road that wound north toward the ranch. And Eva Collins told herself this was the beginning of something manageable and professional and entirely uncomplex. She was wrong about the last part, but she did not know that yet. The Red Cedar Ranch sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridges of low hills, and it was beautiful in the stark, unornamented way that the Nevada Territory was beautiful in the autumn of 1874. The ranch house was a solid, 2-story structure of timber and adobe, larger than Eva had anticipated, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney from which a thin thread of smoke rose into the sky. Behind it stood a long bunkhouse, a barn of weathered red timber, several smaller outbuildings, and a series of corrals where horses moved in their slow, restless way along the rails. Clyde Keating ran the ranch with a crew of 4. A foreman named Hector Ruiz, a compact and perpetually serious Mexican man in his early 40s who had been with the operation since its founding. 2 younger cowboys named Pete Alderman and Joe Calloway, who were in their mid-20s and occupied themselves primarily with work and competing for Hector's rare approval. And an older hand named Silas Cobb, who had arthritis in both hands but refused to acknowledge it, and whose sole purpose in life appeared to be the care and maintenance of the ranch's horses, which he performed with a devotion that bordered on religious. Eva was shown to her room by Clyde himself, a small but clean room off the kitchen on the ground floor, with a window that looked toward the southern ridge. There was a bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a hook on the wall. It was everything she needed and nothing more, and Eva, who had been doing without for several years, felt an unexpected wave of gratitude so strong it very nearly showed on her face. She put it away quickly and thanked him with professional composure. The first morning was the hardest, as first mornings generally were. She rose before the sun, which she had always done, and dressed carefully in the particular way she always dressed, the loose, dark skirt that moved easily with her stride and concealed the irregular movement of her lower body. The practical boots she had specially fitted on one side to minimize the visible discrepancy. She pulled her brown hair back from her face and tied it neatly at the nape of her neck, and stood for a moment at the window watching the sky go from black to deep purple to the first pale wash of morning gold. Then she went into the kitchen and began to work. She had always been most herself in a kitchen. The rhythm of it, the fire building, the water drawing, the flour measuring, the quiet physics of making food from raw things, settled her in a way that very little else did. By the time the ranch hands began to emerge from the bunkhouse at 5:30, she had biscuits in the oven, salt pork frying in the large iron skillet, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, which she had learned was the only acceptable form of coffee in cattle country. She moved carefully in that kitchen, especially on the first morning, when she was still mapping the space, still learning the distances between the stove and the work table and the door to the back porch where the water barrel sat. She kept her movements efficient, economical, picking paths that minimized the need for sudden direction changes or quick pivots, which were the movements most likely to reveal her. She had become something of a master of this geography, this art of navigating space in a way that looked perfectly natural and cost her considerably more than it appeared. The men ate with the unceremonious hunger of men who worked outdoors before dawn, and the biscuits were pronounced excellent, and Pete Alderman asked if there would be pie by supper time, and Hector told him to mind himself and be grateful for what was on his plate, and old Silas drank 3 cups of coffee and said nothing at all to anyone, which Eva gathered was simply his way. Clyde Keating sat at the head of the table and ate without fuss and said thank you when he was done, and his eyes moved over her once briefly when she turned from the stove to refill the coffee, and then he was out the door and gone with the rest of them into the early light. Eva stood in the kitchen for a moment after they had all gone and allowed herself to breathe, and the relief was so complete it made her slightly dizzy. She had done it. She had cooked the first meal. She had moved through the space for 2 full hours without anyone looking at her twice. Whatever morning stiffness the cold had put into her left leg, whatever additional awkwardness the long coach journey had left in her bones, she had worked through it invisibly, and no one had seen a thing, and she was still employed. She washed the dishes and then took a slow tour of the kitchen and the adjoining rooms to plan her days, and she let herself limp freely then because she was alone and she was tired, and alone was the only time she ever allowed it. The weeks settled into a pattern. She cooked. She cleaned. She kept the ranch house in a state of order that Pete Alderman said was slightly alarming and that Hector Ruiz said was appropriate and that Silas appeared not to notice. She made bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. She made soup on the coldest evenings, which became more frequent as October deepened toward November. She mended what needed mending, because the men were hard on their clothing, and Clyde paid her the extra dime per item without complaint. She kept the kitchen fire going through the night so the mornings were never completely cold, and she kept the pantry inventoried and the root cellar stocked against the winter. She also, with considerable effort and considerable discipline, continued to hide her limp. It was not precisely that she was ashamed of it. She had moved past shame somewhere in the 2nd year after the accident, when she had decided that feeling sorry for herself was a luxury she could not afford, and that the limb was part of her body, and she would make the best of it. But she was not naive. She understood what men in 1874 thought of a woman with a physical impairment, especially in a working environment, especially in a place this remote, where the assumption was that everyone had to carry their full weight without accommodation. She had worked too hard to get here, come too far on that rattling coach, written too careful a letter, and sat through too careful an interview to lose the position now over something she had been managing perfectly well for 3 years. So she managed. She timed her movements carefully. She kept her most difficult hours, the early morning when the cold made the legs stiffest, and the late evening when fatigue accumulated into something approaching genuine pain, to the times when she was alone or very nearly alone. She organized the kitchen so that the things she reached for most were at heights and distances that minimized strain. She sat when she could sit without it looking like anything other than ordinary rest. She stood when she had to stand. She walked when she had to walk, and she walked well, and she kept her chin up. Clyde Keating noticed on the first day. He did not say anything. He did not think he needed to say anything immediately. And he was the kind of man who believed that if something did not require immediate action, it was better considered slowly rather than acted upon quickly. He had seen the slight irregularity in her gait when she descended from the wagon that first evening, had noticed the particular way she placed the left foot that spoke of long practice in minimizing something rather than any natural variation in stride. He had seen it, and he had looked away before she could see him looking, and he had thought about it that night lying in his bunk, and by morning he had made his decision. She could cook. She could keep house. She was clearly intelligent and capable, and had written him a letter so forthright and competent that he had hired her on the letter alone before he had even met her in person. Whatever was happening with her leg, she had clearly been managing it for some time and managing it well. It was not slowing her down in any way that affected the work, and it was, in any case, her business to disclose or not disclose as she saw fit. He went back to work and said nothing. But he watched. In the quiet way he watched most things, with attention that was not intrusive but was thorough, and he noticed every small adaptation she had made. The way she had reorganized the kitchen within the first week, moving the heavy pots to a lower shelf where they could be slid rather than lifted. The particular route she walked between the house and the root cellar, which he realized was slightly longer than the direct path but notably smoother. The way she leaned briefly against the doorframe when she thought no one was looking, before straightening and continuing on. None of it changed what he thought of her work. All of it increased, quietly and without his full permission, what he thought of her. October turned cold and then colder, and the first hard frost came in the middle of the month, silvering the grass in the valley and making the mornings sharp as broken glass. Eva woke earlier to allow more time for the leg to warm and loosen, and she built the kitchen fire higher, and she still had the biscuits on the table before any of the men appeared. Hector Ruiz noticed this on the third morning of frost and said, with the careful respect that was his highest form of praise, that she ran a better kitchen than the man who had held the position before her, and that man had been cooking on ranches for 15 years. Eva thanked him with the professional composure she always used and went back to her work. Clyde came in that evening after the rest of the men had eaten, and she was washing the last of the supper dishes. He usually ate with the hands but occasionally came in late, when some task had held him past the supper hour, and on those evenings she kept a plate warm for him on the back of the stove. She had not been asked to do this. She had simply started doing it because it seemed the obvious thing, and it had not occurred to her that kindness required invitation. He hung his hat and coat at the door and sat at the table, and she set the plate in front of him and poured coffee and began to return to the dishes, and he said, "You do not have to stand there working while I eat, Miss Collins." "The dishes need doing," she said. "The dishes can wait 10 minutes, he said. "Sit down if you like." She considered this for a moment, because it was an unusual sort of invitation from an employer, and then she dried her hands on the kitchen towel and sat across from him at the table, because her leg had been aching since 3 o'clock and the prospect of sitting was very welcome indeed. They talked. Or rather, he talked and she answered, which was more or less how their earliest conversations went. He told her about the herd and the coming winter and the concerns about snowfall in the northern pass. He told her, somewhat unexpectedly, about how he had come to Nevada from Texas 6 years ago, following a friend who had told him the land in the territory was cheap and the cattle business was wide open, and how that friend had turned out to be exactly right. He told her about the first winter he had spent here, which had been a severe one, and how he had nearly lost the whole herd. She listened with her hands folded on the table, because listening was something she did very well, and she found that she was genuinely interested, not performing interest the way one did to be polite, but actually curious about the shape of the life that had been assembled in this place. "What brought you to Harrow Creek?" he asked eventually, setting down his fork. Eva answered, as she always answered, that she had needed a change and that the position had suited her. This was true as far as it went. What it did not mention was Sacramento, or the accident, or the years she had spent rebuilding herself from the inside out in that boarding house while she waited to be well enough, capable enough, confident enough to try something entirely new. He did not press her, which was one of the first things she decided she liked about Clyde Keating. He asked and he listened, and he did not excavate. "Well," he said, picking up his hat from the table and preparing to leave, "you make good biscuits, Miss Collins, and you run a tight house, and the men are considerably happier than they were before you came. I am glad you answered the advertisement." "So am I," she said, and meant it. He left, and she sat for another few minutes at the table in the warm kitchen, and the ache in her leg was still there, but sitting had helped it considerably, and she thought about the way he had looked at her when he said he was glad she had come, that direct, clear hazel gaze with nothing complicated behind it, or rather with something she could not yet read, and she told herself firmly that she was his employee, and he was her employer, and that was the entire extent of it. And then she went to bed. She thought about his eyes for a while before she fell asleep. She told herself this was inevitable given the isolation and nothing more. November arrived with wind. The Nevada Territory had whined the way. Some places had rain, relentlessly, variably, sometimes from the northwest in long moaning sheets, and sometimes in sudden sharp gusts that came from nowhere and knocked over anything that was not securely weighted. Eva learned to latch everything before she went to bed, and to wear an extra layer when she went out to the root cellar or the woodpile, and to time her outdoor excursions to the calmer parts of the day. She also, around the middle of November, made a small but significant error. She had gone to the root cellar for potatoes in the early evening, and the path was slick from a thin skin of ice that had formed since the afternoon, and she was tired, genuinely tired in a way that had accumulated over several weeks of early mornings and long days, and she was not paying quite as close attention as she should have been, and her left foot caught the edge of a loose stone and she stumbled. She caught herself on the root cellar door. It took perhaps 3 seconds, and she was upright again immediately, but in those 3 seconds her body had moved with complete honesty, grabbing and twisting, and compensating in exactly the way she moved when she was alone and no one was watching, and when she straightened and turned around, Clyde Keating was standing 10 feet away on the path with an armful of split wood. Their eyes met. Eva's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the November temperature. She said before he could say anything at all, "I am fine, the ice caught me." "I can see that," he said. His voice was even. He adjusted the armful of wood. "Do you need a hand with the cellar door?" "No," she said, and turned and opened the cellar door and went down the 3 steps with more care than she had taken coming out, and she stayed down there longer than she needed to, ostensibly sorting through the potato bin, actually standing very still in the dark and cold, and letting her heart slow down from the rate it had reached when she had turned and found him watching. When she came back up with the potatoes, he was gone. The wood was stacked neatly beside the back door, which he must have deposited there on his way past. She went inside and made the potatoes and served supper and said nothing, and he said nothing, and nothing changed, and she told herself that what had passed between them on that path was nothing more than a stumble and a look, and that he had already forgotten it. She was wrong about that too, but she did not know it yet. The incident settled something in Clyde that had been unsettled for weeks. He had been watching her for 2 months, with that quiet attention he brought to things that mattered, and he had been patient about what he saw and respectful of the fact that she had chosen not to explain it, and all of it had been building slowly into something he recognized, but had not yet named. When he came around the corner of the house and saw her stumble on the icy path, the cold thing that ran through him was not concern about her fitness for the job. It was something much more personal than that. A quick, specific fear that she might be hurt, followed immediately by relief when she righted herself, followed immediately by the awareness that the fear had been considerably stronger than it should have been if she was simply his employee. He spent the next several days thinking about it with the same slow deliberateness he applied to everything, and he came to a conclusion, and having come to it, he began very quietly and very carefully to act on it. He did not say anything directly. He was not the kind of man who said things before he was sure of them, and he was not yet sure enough. But he started finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the early morning, not often enough to be unusual, but often enough. He took to drinking his second cup of coffee at the table rather than on the porch, which meant that Eva was frequently still in the kitchen, and they fell into a habit of conversation that began with the weather and the cattle and the state of the root cellar, and expanded, gradually and naturally, into other things. She told him about growing up in Ohio, in a small town outside of Columbus where her father had been a school teacher, and her mother had made quilts of extraordinary complexity and beauty. She told him about coming west at 23, which was 3 years ago now, and about Sacramento, though she still did not tell him about the accident, and he did not ask. She told him about reading, which was her great private pleasure, and about the 3 books she had brought in her trunk, which she had read several times each now. He went to the general store in Harrow Creek the following week, and came back with 2 new ones he had asked Mrs. Pike at the counter to select, and he left them on the kitchen table without ceremony. And when Eva came in from the root cellar and saw them, she stood very still for a moment, and then she picked up the top one and read the title, and something in her face shifted, softened, and she looked up and found him watching her from the doorway with those hazel eyes, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Keating." And he said, "Clyde," and she said, "Thank you, Clyde." And that was the first time she had used his name, and something in both of them noticed. The first time Eva saw Clyde Keating truly angry was in the 3rd week of November, and it rearranged her understanding of him considerably. A man came to the ranch, a cattle buyer from the south named Garrett, who arrived unannounced on a Tuesday and sat himself down in the main room with the assumption of someone who expected to be accommodated without asking. He was loud and expansive in the way that certain men in the territory were loud and expansive, taking up space aggressively and filling silences with opinions no one had requested. Eva served him coffee because it was her job to do so, and he watched her cross the room with a look that she recognized from various points in her life, the look of a man cataloging, assessing, finding fault, or finding entertainment in what he saw. When she set the cup down, he said, loudly enough that Clyde could hear from where he stood across the room, "What is the matter with your leg, girl?" The room went very quiet. Eva did not flinch. She had had 3 years to learn not to flinch at this particular kind of question, asked in this particular kind of tone by this particular kind of man. She straightened up from setting down the cup and said, in a voice of complete neutrality, "Nothing that concerns you, sir," and began to turn away. Garrett laughed. "No offense intended. Just noticed you walking a little sideways is all." What happened next was swift. Clyde crossed the room in perhaps 4 steps and stood close enough to Garrett that the cattle buyer had to look up at him. And Clyde's voice, when he spoke, was still quiet, still even, but it had taken on a quality that was very like the quality of air before a lightning strike, charged with something that had nowhere to go but somewhere it was definitely going. "You are in my house," Clyde said, "speaking to a woman in my employ, and I will ask you once to remember your manners. If there is business to be done between us, we will do it outside and I will hear your offer. If there is not, then your coffee is paid for and you are welcome to the road." Garrett looked at him for a moment, and something in what he saw there convinced him that the single warning was exactly that, and he cleared his throat and said there was business to discuss, and yes, outside would suit him fine. He left his coffee unfinished and preceded Clyde out the door. Eva stood in the room for a long moment after the door closed. She was not a woman who was easily moved by gestures of protection. She had been protecting herself for long enough that she was somewhat impatient with the idea that protection was something to be grateful for. But what Clyde had done was not the heavy-handed variety of protection that she associated with men who thought women needed to be kept from the world. He had not told Garrett she was wounded or fragile or deserving of pity. He had simply made it very clear that she was a person who would be spoken to with courtesy in his house, and the distinction mattered to her enormously. She heard the business between him and Garrett concluded briefly and not particularly warmly in the yard, and then the sound of the cattle buyer's horse departing, and then Clyde's boots on the porch and the door opening. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I apologize for that," he said. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "The man is a bore," Clyde said. "He will not be back here." "The cattle business," she said carefully, "is important to the ranch. I would not have you lose a buyer on my account." "There are other buyers," he said simply, and went to pour himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had not yet removed from the table, and sat down, and said, as though continuing a conversation they had been having moments ago instead of the one they had been having, "What were you reading last night?" Eva looked at him for another moment, and then she sat down across from him and told him about the book, and they sat in the ranch house kitchen in the late morning of that November day and talked about books while outside the wind moved across the Nevada hills, and Eva Collins felt something turn over in her chest like a key in a lock, quiet and decisive and irreversible. She still did not tell him about the leg. She had her reasons which seemed good to her, and they were as follows. She had been hired without disclosing it, and disclosing it now would call into question why she had not done so from the beginning, and she was not ready for that conversation, which was not only a conversation about a heel-drawn bone, but also about everything she had felt and feared and survived in the years since the accident. And that was not a conversation she knew how to have with a man she had known for only 2 months, employer or otherwise. She also, if she was entirely honest with herself, which she generally was, did not want to see what would happen to those hazel eyes if she told him. She did not want to see them fill with pity or concern or recalculation, because she had seen that happen with other people, and she was not sure she could bear it from him. December arrived and brought proper snow, not the half-hearted dusting of November, but real snow, deep and deliberate, filling the valley overnight on the 4th of December so that Eva woke to a world that had been rewritten in white. She stood at her bedroom window in the dark of early morning and looked at it and felt a sudden, complicated tenderness for this place that surprised her. She had not expected to love Nevada. She had come here for practical reasons and had assumed it would remain practical. But the valley was extraordinary in snow, the ridges on either side dark against the white, and the sky above them a blue so deep it was almost purple, and the ranch buildings in their orderly arrangement below like a small civilized island in an immense and beautiful silence. The cold made the leg worse, as cold always did, and she took extra time dressing, and did a set of careful movements she had developed herself over the years that helped the joint loosen before she had to use it properly. Then she went to the kitchen and built the fire and started the coffee and began the morning. Silas, who always came in first, stomped the snow from his boots at the door and said that the north pasture fence had come down in the night, and the herd was going to require some work. And Eva put extra food on the table because she understood that a day of fence work in snow required more of a man than a day of ordinary ranch work. Clyde came in last, already in his heavy coat, already planning the day in his head, and she handed him his coffee, and he wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at her over the rim with something in his expression that she had started to see more frequently. "You were up early," he said. "I am always up early," she said. "Earlier than usual," he said. She had not thought he noticed the particular hour of her rising. "The snow woke me," she said, which was true enough. He nodded, looking at her over the coffee mug, and then he said, "The road to town will be bad today. If you need anything from the general store, make a list and I will bring it when we go in next week." It was a practical statement. It was simply him managing his ranch and his obligations. She knew that. But there was a specific quality to the way he was looking at her when he said it, a specific attention that had nothing to do with lists and general stores. And she said, "Thank you, Clyde." And he nodded and put down the mug and went out into the snow. And she watched him cross the yard from the kitchen window with her hands around her own mug. And the feeling in her chest was growing large enough that she was beginning to have difficulty pretending it was not there. Christmas came quietly to the Red Cedar Ranch. She had made a plum pudding, which had required correspondence with Mrs. Pike at the general store 2 weeks in advance to ensure the proper ingredients arrived on the last supply wagon before the holiday. She had also made pies, several of them, apple and dried cherry, and a molasses one that Pete Alderman said was the finest thing he had eaten in the territory, which she accepted with the understanding that Pete's frame of reference was somewhat limited. Clyde brought in a branch of cedar from the hills and set it in the main room, which was as much decoration as the ranch house received, but it filled the room with its clean, sharp scent and lent the evening a particular quality. The men ate together at the big table in the main room instead of the kitchen, and there was whiskey produced from somewhere, which Eva pretended not to see, and Silas, who almost never spoke, told a story about a Christmas blizzard in Wyoming 12 years ago that turned out to be genuinely harrowing and also somehow funny. And they all sat around that table in the cedar-scented room, while the snow continued outside, and Eva Collins thought that she could not remember the last time Christmas had felt like this, full and warm, and exactly where she was supposed to be. After the men had gone to the bunkhouse, she stayed at the table clearing the remains of the meal, and Clyde stayed too, as he often did now in the evenings, and they talked, and the fire burned low, and at some point the conversation turned to what Eva had not anticipated. He asked about the accident. He did not ask it directly. He asked, with that gentle indirection she had come to associate with him, whether she had been in Nevada before Sacramento, and when she said no, Sacramento had been her first stop west. He asked what had brought her from Ohio to Sacramento in the first place, and she told him about the aunt who had offered her a place to stay when things at home became difficult. And he asked, without pressure, what had made things difficult. And Eva, sitting in the firelight on Christmas evening with her leg aching mildly from the long days standing, and the whiskey warm in her blood, and the cedar smell in the air, and those hazel eyes on her with their characteristic steadiness, told him the truth. Not all of it, not everything, but the essential truth. She told him about the accident on the Tuesday morning in Sacramento, the wagon that had come too fast around the corner of the Market Street, the impact that had sent her into the wall of the building beside her, the shattered leg and the long recovery, and the surgeon who had done his best and the bone that had not healed straight. She told him about the months of learning to walk again, the relearning that had been harder in some ways than the original learning, because she had to overwrite something her body already thought it knew. She told him about losing the seamstress position because the owner of the shop said she could not have someone who moved slowly on the floor, and about the boarding house that had taken her in as a cook in exchange for a room, and about the 3 years of rebuilding. She told him all of it in a level voice with her hands flat on the table, and she watched his face while she did, braced for the shift she had been dreading, the softening into pity, the change in how he looked at her. He did not look at her differently. He listened with that complete, unhurried attention he brought to things that mattered, and when she had finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said simply, "I noticed the first day." Eva blinked. Her hands were still flat on the table, and she felt the words land in her like a stone into still water, sending rings outward. "What?" she said very quietly. "When you came down from the wagon," he said, "the first evening. I noticed then." The silence stretched between them in the fire-lit room, and Eva worked through what this meant: the careful architecture of 2.5 months, the discipline, the early mornings and long evenings, the planned routes and the reorganized shelves and the practiced walk, all of it, and he had seen through it on the very first day. "You said nothing," she said. "It was your business to say," he said. "Not mine." "And the work," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "You hired me knowing, and the work has been acceptable to you." "The work has been considerably more than acceptable," he said, and there was something in his voice now that was different from his usual even quiet, something that had a quality of warmth to it, and he looked at her across the table in a way that was completely unambiguous, at least to her now, and said, "It has never changed a single thing I thought of you, Eva, not from the first day." She was Eva now, not Miss Collins. She sat with that for a long moment, and the rings from the stone were still spreading outward, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time, 3 years, perhaps longer, perhaps since the accident, perhaps since before that. Some held breath she had not known she was holding finally allowed to release. "I was afraid," she said, and her voice was quiet but steady, because Eva Collins had decided years ago that she would be honest when she decided to be honest, and she had decided that now was the time. "I was afraid you would not have hired me if you had known, and I was afraid that if I told you after you had hired me, you would reconsider." "I would not have," he said, "and I would not reconsider now." She looked at him. She had looked at him many times in these months, in the kitchen, at the table, across the yard, from the window, but this was a different kind of looking, with the pretense finally removed, with the thing between them named not in words but in the willingness to sit in a room together and say true things. "I am not a woman who needs accommodating," she said. "I can see that," he said. "I have been watching you for 2.5 months, and I can see it very clearly." "Then what is it you are saying to me?" she asked, because she needed to hear it plainly. "I am saying," he said, with a slowness that was not hesitation but care, the same care he brought to everything important, "that I would very much like to continue this conversation. Not tonight necessarily, but in general, for a long time." Eva Collins looked at Clyde Keating across the Christmas table in the fire-lit room, with the cedar smell and the snow outside, and the ranch hands' voices distant across the yard, and she felt the truth of her own heart clear and complete and without qualification, and she said, "I believe I would like that too." He did not reach for her hand across the table. He was a careful man, and it was Christmas evening, and they were employer and employee, and there were things to be done in an orderly fashion. But he looked at her with those hazel eyes, and something in them was unguarded in a way she had not seen before, and she thought that the particular quality of this man, his patience and his steadiness, and the way he had known for 2.5 months and said nothing and changed nothing, was something she was entirely unprepared for and entirely not sorry about. They talked for another hour after that about smaller things, easier things, the way people talk when something large has been established and the small things can finally be allowed their space. And then she cleared the rest of the table and he banked the fire, and she went to her room, and she lay in her bed in the dark and listened to the snow settling against the window and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt safe, not protected in the way that diminished her, but safe in the way of being known, of having been seen clearly and found not wanting, and that was something she had forgotten was possible. January was the hardest month on the ranch in practical terms, the snow deepest and the days shortest, and the cattle requiring constant attention as the weather pushed them into the lower pastures, and the hay supply became something to be managed carefully. Clyde and the hands were out in it from before dawn most days, and Eva kept the house warm and the food ready, and the door always open for whoever came in half frozen from the wind, needing something hot and somewhere to sit. She and Clyde had more of those conversations, the long ones at the kitchen table. Sometimes in the evenings, sometimes, when work permitted, in the brief space of late afternoon. They grew familiar with each other in the way that people who talk honestly grow familiar, not through the accumulation of facts, but through the accumulation of understanding. She knew, by February, that he had lost his father when he was 17, and that this had been the pivot point of his life, the thing that had sent him west because staying in Texas had been impossible after. She knew that he had been to school for 4 years, which was more than most men in his position, and that he read widely and thought carefully, and that the unhurried quality of his manner was not slowness but a deliberate choice to do things properly rather than quickly. He knew about her mother and the quilts and the Ohio schoolhouse. He knew about the boarding house and the women who had lived there with her, several of them in circumstances that had required considerable resilience, and about the friendships she had made there that had kept her afloat through the worst of the recovery. He knew she was 26 years old and had read more books than most people she had ever met, and that she had very strong opinions about how coffee should be made that happened to align entirely with his own. He also knew, because she had told him, that she was never going to stop having the limp, that the leg was what it was going to be, that 3 years of management had not improved it significantly and were unlikely to do so further. She had told him this matter-of-factly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late January while the wind drove snow against the window, and he had listened and then said, "All right," and meant it so completely that there was nothing more she needed to say. February brought a crisis of the ordinary ranch variety, a section of the barn roof collapsing under ice load, which required 3 days of urgent repair in temperatures that were genuinely dangerous. Eva kept the kitchen running continuously through those 3 days, rotating food and hot coffee to whoever came in from the work at whatever hour they arrived, keeping the fire banked high and the lamps bright against the early dark. She slept in short intervals and got up again and was there in the kitchen every time someone appeared at the door. And on the 3rd evening, when the repair was declared completed and the men came in exhausted and half-frozen, she had a full supper ready and something that could reasonably be called a celebration cake, made from dried apples and the last of the winter spices. Clyde came in last, as he always did when there was work to be finished, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and then at her, and the look on his face was something she had not seen from him before, not admiration exactly, not simply gratitude, something more specific and more personal than either of those. "Eva," he said. "Sit down," she said. "You look like a man who has been in the cold for 3 days." "I have been in the cold for 3 days," he said, and sat, and she put a plate in front of him and poured his coffee, and he ate in silence for a while, and then he said, "I do not know what I would have done without you here this winter." "You would have managed," she said. "I would have managed the barn," he said. "I am not sure about the rest of it." She sat down across from him because it was late and the other men were in the bunkhouse, and the kitchen was warm and her leg was tired, and she was past the age of pretending she did not want to sit when she could sit. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him, this man who was sun-browned and frostbit and tired to his bones, and looking at her like she was the warm center of the whole cold world. "I have been thinking," he said, "about asking you something. I want to be sure I am asking it properly." "You have been thinking about it for a while," she said, because she had not gotten to 26 without learning to read the signals a person sent before they were ready to send them openly. "Since Christmas, more or less," he said. She waited. "I realize this is not a simple thing," he said. "You came here as my employee, and that means there is an imbalance to consider, and I do not want to put you in a position that is uncomfortable. So I am going to say it plainly, and you are welcome to tell me plainly if the answer is no, and nothing at all will change about your position here, and I mean that." "I know you mean it," she said. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with the intention of asking you to marry me, eventually, when you have had enough time to decide whether I am someone you would be willing to marry. I am not asking for an answer to that tonight, only for permission to make my intentions clear." Eva looked at him for a long, full moment. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the window. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Pete Alderman was audible even at this distance, telling some story that made Hector's voice cut across his in what was probably a reprimand. "Clyde," she said, "you should know that I am not going to become easier to live with than I am right now. My leg is always going to be like this. I am going to have bad days when the cold is bad or when I am tired, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." "I know that," he said. "I am also not a woman who accommodates herself to a man's preferences as a general practice," she said. "I have opinions and I intend to keep having them." "I am aware of that as well," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile but the direction of one. "It is not a disqualification." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "You may make your intentions clear, Clyde Keating, and I will tell you mine in return, which are similar in nature." The smile arrived fully then, and it was a good one, the kind that reached the hazel eyes and made them lighter, and Eva Collins sat across from this man in the kitchen of his ranch house in the Nevada Territory in February of 1874, and felt the future arrange itself before her like country she had not expected to reach, but was very glad to have found. The courtship was, in the way of most things between them, conducted with care and honesty, and a good deal of time spent talking at the kitchen table. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, which arrived hesitantly in March, and then with conviction in April, when the valley suddenly bloomed with the fierce brief color that the high desert produced each year as if making up for its winter austerity. She pinned them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill and said nothing sentimental about it, but did not remove them until they were entirely past saving. He took her riding in the late afternoons when the work allowed it, which she had not told him she loved, but which she had always loved because on horseback the leg made no difference at all, and she could move with complete freedom, and the horse she rode was a deep red mare named Copper that Silas had selected for her with the grave intentionality with which he made all his horsing decisions. Riding across the valley in the April light on Copper's smooth back beside Clyde on his tall gray gelding, the hills ahead and the sky enormous above them, Eva felt a joy that was uncomplicated and full and entirely her own, and she let herself feel it without qualification. Pete Alderman told Joe Calloway at some point in March that something was happening between the boss and Miss Collins, and Joe told him he was not blind and had been observing this since January, and Hector told them both that they would not discuss the private business of the people who employed them, and that if he heard either of them speculating on the subject again, they would find themselves mending fence in the north pasture for a week regardless of the weather. Silas said nothing because he was Silas, but he had been making small improvements to Copper's tack for several weeks that were, if examined carefully, improvements specifically geared toward comfort for a rider with uneven weight distribution, and this was the only comment he made on the situation, and it was characteristic and sufficient. Spring advanced into a genuinely beautiful Nevada May, and the ranch was busy with the kind of productive, purposeful work that made all the winter's difficulty worthwhile. Calves arriving and branding done, and the herd moved to the upper pastures and fences checked, and the whole machinery of the cattle operation clicking into gear for another season. Eva planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the ranch house, which had not existed before her tenure, because she had decided the ranch needed fresh vegetables in summer, and she was going to make sure it had them. Clyde helped her dig the beds on a Sunday afternoon in early May, the only day the week afforded something approaching leisure, and they worked companionably in the warm sun while the hands were at their own Sunday occupations, and at some point, Eva straightened from planting the first row of beans and found him looking at her with an expression that meant he was about to say something he had been preparing. "I meant to wait until summer," he said. "For what?" She said, though she knew. "I meant to give you more time," he said, "but I find that my patience has run out, which is unusual for me." She set down the trowel. "Eva Collins," he said, and he did not go down on one knee because the ground was muddy and he was a practical man, but he looked at her with a directness and a seriousness that needed no augmentation from ceremony. "I would like to marry you. I would like to spend my life with you on this ranch, and I would like you to have whatever you need here, and I would like to sit across from you at that table for the rest of my life and talk about books and cattle and anything else you care to discuss. And I would like to tell you, before you answer, that I am aware of exactly who you are and exactly what you manage, and that none of it is a problem, and all of it is something I have come to love." Eva stood in the kitchen garden in the May sunshine with mud on her hands and her hair slightly disordered from the garden work, and she looked at Clyde Keating, who was also muddy and also serious and also looking at her, as though she was the most important thing in his considerable line of sight, and she said, "Yes." He crossed the garden bed between them and took both her muddy hands in both his muddy hands and looked at her very closely and said, "Are you certain?" "Clyde," she said, "I have been certain since January. I was simply waiting for you to get there." He laughed, and it was a good laugh, surprised and genuine, and then he bent his head and kissed her for the first time, carefully at first and then with more conviction, and the May sun was warm on both of them, and somewhere behind the barn copper neighed at something, and it was not the most dramatic setting for a proposal, and it was exactly right. They were married in June in the little schoolhouse that doubled as a church in Harrow Creek, because Eva wanted to be married properly, and Clyde wanted whatever she wanted. The minister who served the town came out from Reno twice monthly, and they arranged their date around his schedule, and Mrs. Pike from the general store organized, with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for an excuse, a proper celebration for the town's most recent marriage, which involved a great deal of food, and the appearance of a fiddle player from somewhere that no one had previously known existed. Eva wore a dress she made herself from a length of pale blue cotton she had ordered specially from Sacramento, and it was simple because she was a simple dresser, but it was beautifully made because she had been a seamstress for years before the accident, and the skill had not left her hands. Hector stood with Clyde because Clyde asked him to, and because it was the kind of honor that Hector received without display but felt deeply. Old Silas wore a clean shirt, which was considered by everyone on the Red Cedar to be equivalent to a formal suit. Eva walked down the short aisle of the schoolhouse on her own because her father was in Ohio and there was no one else, and she did not limp, or rather she did what she always did. She walked with the discipline of long practice, but today she did not do it because she was afraid of being seen. She did it because she wanted to be her own best self on this particular morning, and when she reached Clyde and he took her hands, she saw in his eyes that he had seen exactly how she walked and had found it, as he had always found everything about her, exactly as it should be. The minister spoke the words. Clyde spoke his. Eva spoke hers without wavering, in the clear, steady voice that was her natural register when she was saying something she meant entirely. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the windows of the wagon open and the warm June air moving through, and Clyde kept one hand on the reins and one hand over hers on the seat between them. And she looked at the Nevada hills going golden in the declining sun, and thought of Ohio and Sacramento, and the boarding house, and the Tuesday morning that had shattered her leg, and the advertisement she had clipped from the newspaper, and the stagecoach ride, and the careful steps she had taken on that first afternoon on the main street of Harrow Creek, lying with her body for the sake of a chance. And she thought that the chance had turned out to be larger than she had imagined when she had reached for it. The summer passed with a sweetness that neither of them mentioned directly, because they were both people who held their happiness quietly rather than displaying it, but it was present in everything. In the way he still brought her coffee in the morning, in the way she still saved him a plate on the evenings he came in late, in the long rides in the evening light, and the conversations at the kitchen table that had been going since January and would apparently continue indefinitely. And in the mornings when she woke in the room that was now their room and found the window full of Nevada sky in him, already quietly awake beside her, reading one of the books from the shelf she had organized on the wall, and it was so ordinary and so right that it sometimes stopped her breath. Her leg had a bad week in August when a heat system moved through, and the air pressure changed in a way that she had learned affected the healed bone. She was more open about it now, not performing wellness when she was not feeling it, and on the worst day she sat on the porch in the shade with a cool cloth on the joint and read one of her books while the ranch operated perfectly well without her for a few hours. Because Clyde had made sure she understood that the ranch operating on any given day did not depend on her being on her feet every moment of it. Hector, passing the porch that afternoon on some errand, paused and said, with the directness that was his way, "You should ask Clyde about the tonic Silas uses for his hands in the cold. It has willow bark in it, helps with the ache." Eva looked at him. "You knew," she said. "I have been ranching for 20 years, Hector said. "I know a person who is managing pain." He paused. "You work hard and you do good work. The men respect you." He walked on before she could respond, which was also characteristic, and Eva sat on the porch in the August shade and felt a warmth entirely separate from the heat in the air. Autumn came again, the Red Cedar's second autumn with Eva in it, and the garden she had planted in May yielded everything she had hoped it would, and some things she had not expected, including a variety of squash that the seed packet had not specifically promised. She put up preserves and dried herbs and pickled things, filling the cellar with the winter's supply, and the ranch house going into its second winter was considerably better stocked than it had been going into its first. She was also, by October, certain that she was expecting a child. She told Clyde on a quiet evening in the kitchen, the same table where so much had already been established between them, and his face went through several rapid expressions before settling into something she could only describe as a combination of shock and complete joy. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, the thing she had expected because he was who he was, and she told him she was well and the leg was a separate matter that the baby would not affect. She had spoken to the doctor in Harrow Creek, and he had confirmed this with enough conviction that she believed it. Clyde reached across the table and took her hand, and then seemed to reconsider the distance and came around the table and sat beside her instead, and he held her hand in both of his and said, "I did not expect this so soon." "Nor did I," she said. "Are you pleased?" "Eva," he said, and his voice was full in a way she had only heard a few times, the way it got when something reached past his usual steadiness and moved him genuinely. "I am so pleased that I cannot find a word large enough for it." She leaned against his shoulder because she could now, because that was one of the things that had changed with the summer. She had learned to lean, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the kitchen that they had occupied together through a whole cycle of seasons and contemplated the next thing that was coming. The baby arrived in June, on a morning of early summer heat that made the valley shimmer, and it was a boy, a small, loud, profoundly determined boy whom they named Daniel after Eva's father. Clyde, who had delivered calves on dozens of occasions and had a somewhat pragmatic view of the physical realities of birth, was present throughout in the same way he was present for everything, steady and attentive and useful. And when Daniel arrived, and the exhaustion and the considerable difficulty of it was over, and Eva held the baby in the bed in their room with the window full of morning light, Clyde sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them with those hazel eyes full of something she had no words for but entirely understood. Daniel Keating was a robust and vocal infant who had his father's steady eyes and his mother's determined expression, and he grew in the way of ranch babies, surrounded by the warmth and noise of a working household, becoming familiar early with the smell of horses and coffee and bread, and the sound of boots on board floors and wind against windows. Eva recovered well. Her leg gave her some difficulty in the months following the birth, as the change in her body's distribution had shifted stresses she had spent years learning to manage. but she adapted with the same systematic attention she had always applied, found new patterns, new routes, new ways of carrying herself that accounted for the new arrangement of her body. And by the following spring she was back in the garden with Daniel in a basket in the shade of the porch, planting the second season's seeds, while Silas watched the baby with an expression of extreme seriousness from the barn doorway. Harrow Creek grew in those years. A proper church was built, and a real school that was only a school. A doctor established a proper practice. 2 new families arrived and homesteaded the land to the east of the Red Cedar, and Eva found, in the women of those families, something she had not had in Nevada until that point: real friends, women who came to the ranch on Saturdays and drank coffee at her kitchen table, and talked with the kind of honesty that women shared when there were no men present and no performances required. She told her friend Ruth Alderman, who was no relation to Pete but who had the same frank manner, about the accident. She told it without the careful editing she had applied to it for years, told it fully, including the fear and the recovery and the years of hiding it, and Ruth listened with her elbows on Eva's kitchen table and said, when Eva had finished, "I knew about the leg the second week you were here. You moved differently when you thought no one was watching. I thought it must be something like that." Eva laughed, and it was a real laugh, surprised and slightly rueful. "Did everyone know?" she asked. "I cannot speak for everyone," Ruth said, "but I expect anyone who was paying attention knew. The ones who would have held it against you were not worth worrying about." Eva thought of Clyde saying, simply, "I noticed the first day." She thought of Hector's comment on the porch. She thought of Silas and his careful adjustments to Copper's tack. "No," she said, "I suppose they were not. The Red Cedar grew too." Clyde bought the adjacent eastern section from a homesteader who decided Nevada was not for him after his second hard winter, and expanded the operation, adding 10 more hands over the following years and a second barn, and a proper office separate from the house where Clyde did the ranch accounts instead of at the kitchen table, which Eva had been gently suggesting for 2 years, because she liked having her kitchen table available for its primary purposes. Pete Alderman eventually married a woman from town named Clara, who was small and decisive and thoroughly capable of managing Pete, and Hector continued as foreman, with the authority and composure of someone who has found exactly the place he was meant to be. Silas had his arthritis seen to by the new doctor in Harrow Creek, and was told to rest his hands on alternate days, which he ignored except when Eva caught him at it, and gave him a look that had become, over the years, as authoritative as his own silences. Daniel grew. He grew the way boys on ranches grew, in sudden increments, going to sleep one height and waking taller, learning to ride almost before he could reliably walk, following his father around the corrals with the focused devotion of a small person who has decided exactly who he intends to be. He had Eva's dark brown hair and her determination, and Clyde's eyes and Clyde's quality of unhurried attention. And when he was 3 years old, he climbed the fence of the horse corral to get closer to the horses, and fell off the other side and cut his lip and did not cry. And Eva, who had seen it happen from the kitchen window, and arrived at a run as fast as her leg would carry her, found him sitting in the dust examining the blood on his fingers with intense interest rather than distress. And she sat down in the dirt beside him, and held his face in her hands and checked the cut, and told him firmly that climbing fences unsupervised was not permitted, and he looked at her with his father's hazel eyes and said, "I see it was not an ideal situation," which was something she had heard Clyde say on several occasions, and she was not sure whether to laugh or to be alarmed by how thoroughly he had absorbed the vocabulary of the adults around him. She laughed. She held him close in the dust of the corral and laughed until her eyes watered, and she kissed the top of his head and carried him back to the house. And when Clyde came in that evening and she told him the story, he looked at Daniel with an expression that contained pride of a very specific and particular kind, and then told his son that fences were for looking at, not for climbing, and Daniel said, I am going to be a horseman when I grow up, which Sila's present for supper that evening due to some complicated domestic arrangement that had evolved over the years, received with what appeared to be deep personal satisfaction. Their daughter arrived 2 years after Daniel, in the late autumn of 1878, and they named her Clara, not after Pete's Clara, but after Eva's grandmother, who had been a woman of formidable character and considerable warmth, and who had died in Ohio when Eva was 12. Little Clara Keating arrived in the world with an emphatic opinion about it from the first moment, and maintained that opinion consistently thereafter, which Eva found both familiar and amusing. The night Clara was born, Clyde sat by the window of their room in the late evening after everything was quiet and the baby was sleeping and Eva was finally at rest, and he watched both of them in the lamplight for a long time. And Eva, who was not fully asleep but very nearly, heard him exhale slowly in the way she had come to recognize as his version of being fully, wordlessly moved, the equivalent of what other men might have wept over, expressed in a single breath. She reached out her hand without opening her eyes and he took it, and they sat like that in the quiet of the ranch house, while the Nevada night settled over the valley, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and Daniel slept down the hall and Clara breathed with the perfect small rhythm of the very new. The years moved with the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because there was never a time without difficulty on a working ranch in the Nevada territory, but with the kind of difficulty that was managed and overcome and made the good things more vivid by contrast. Hard winters and dry summers and cattle prices that rose and fell with the unpredictable logic of distant markets. A terrible spring in 1880 when a storm system sat over the valley for 2 weeks and the flooding threatened the lower pastures, and Clyde and every hand on the ranch worked without sufficient sleep for 10 days to move the herd and shore up the vulnerable ground. Eva managed the ranch house through it all, not as a secondary function, but as the operational core of everything, because without the house, without the food and the warmth and the order that kept the men capable of doing the outdoor work, none of it ran. She had stopped thinking of this as something that needed defending, and had long since realized that Clyde had never thought of it as anything other than what it was, essential, valued hers. The kitchen garden became legendary in the valley. Ruth Alderman asked her once how she managed to get the tomatoes to do what they did in Nevada's short season, and Eva explained about the cold frames she had built along the south wall, which were simply frames of scavenged timber and glass from old windows that warmed the soil and extended the season at both ends, and Ruth took the design home and replicated it. And by the following year, 2 other homestead women had done the same, and Eva found that she had, without particularly intending to, become something of an agricultural resource for the surrounding community, which she accepted with the pragmatic generosity that characterized her approach to most things. Daniel at 8 was already a skilled rider and seriously interested in the management of the herd, following Hector around with questions that Hector answered with his characteristic careful thoroughness. Clara at 6 was in school in Harrow Creek, and had opinions about her teacher that she expressed in detail each evening at the supper table, which Eva and Clyde listened to with the attention they had always paid to things their children said, because they were both people who believed children's observations were worth taking seriously. On a spring evening in 1881, Eva sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the last of the daylight with her mending and watched Clyde walking across the yard from the barn. He moved the same way he had always moved, with that long, unhurried stride, and the late light caught the silver that had started coming into his dark hair at the temples, and he was 35 now, and looked entirely like what he was, a man who had spent a decade building something in a hard country and had done it well. He came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair, the one that had become his chair, and stretched out his legs and exhaled the particular exhale of the end of a day's work, and took the cup of coffee she had set there for him without comment, because they had long since reached the point where such things simply appeared where they were needed without requiring discussion. They sat in the evening quiet for a while, the horses in the corral visible over the fence, the children's voices coming from somewhere inside the house, where they were engaged in something that sounded either creative or argumentative or both. The hills to the north were going dark against a sky the color of old copper, and the cedar smell that had given the ranch its name was in the air, faint and clean. "Hector says we can expand the north herd if the pasture holds," Clyde said. "Hector has been saying that for 2 years," Eva said. "You have been saying the pasture needs another good summer first." "It has had 2 good summers," he said. "Then expand the north herd," she said. He turned his head and looked at her with a sideways smile that was a version of the smile she had first seen on that Christmas evening long ago, the surprised and genuine one that was particular to moments when something delighted him unexpectedly. "When did you become an authority on pasture management?" he said. "I live on a cattle ranch," she said. "I have been listening to conversations about pasture management for 7 years. Some of it was bound to stick." He laughed and she laughed, and inside the house Clara's voice rose in something that required adult intervention, and Eva set down her mending and went inside, moving down the porch and through the door with the gait that was simply hers, the particular rhythm of her body that she had stopped apologizing for and stopped performing around and stopped monitoring with the exhausting vigilance of the early days. It was what it was. It had always been what it was. And everything she had built in this valley, the marriage and the children and the kitchen garden and the friendships and the sense of being exactly where she belonged, had been built with it, not despite it, simply alongside it, the same way she had carried everything else in her life, with all of herself, the whole complicated human whole of her. She settled Clara's dispute, which involved a wooden horse that Daniel had carved, and Clara had decided was rightfully hers on the basis of an argument that was creative rather than logically sound. And she made supper, and they ate all together at the table that had been the site of so many of their most important conversations. And Clyde told Daniel about the North Herd expansion and watched his son absorb this information with serious attention. And Clara told them both about a girl at school who could whistle through her teeth, which Clara had now decided was an essential skill she intended to acquire. And Eva served the apple pie she had made in the afternoon, and the evening was warm and full and complete. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eva and Clyde sat at the kitchen table one more time, as they had been sitting at this table for 7 years, with their coffee and the lamp and the sound of the Nevada night outside, and he reached across and took her hand, the way he did sometimes when there was no particular reason except that he wanted to, and she let him hold it and turned her hand over and held his back. 7 years, she said, because it had been on her mind. 7 years, he agreed. Are you satisfied? She asked, with the directness that was her nature, looking for the honest answer rather than the comfortable one. He looked at her across the table, and the lamp was warm on both of them, and the years were in his face, the good years and the hard ones, and his hazel eyes were as clear and steady as they had always been, and he said, "I am the most satisfied man in the Nevada territory, possibly in a larger radius than that." Eva looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "Good answer." She refilled his coffee and her own, and they sat on at the table for another long while, talking about nothing important and everything that was. And outside the stars came out over the Nevada hills in their extraordinary numbers, the big country dark beneath them and the ranch, a small bright light in the middle of it, warm and lit, and occupied by people who had found each other at the edge of a stagecoach descent in 1874, and had been building something worth having ever since. The spring of 1882 brought a letter from Eva's mother in Ohio, who had not written in several months, and in it, her mother mentioned with characteristic understatement that she had not been well, and that the Ohio winters were becoming difficult. Eva read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then told Clyde about it that evening, and by the following week it was decided. Eva would write and invite her mother to come to Nevada, and if her mother agreed, Clyde would ride to Harrow Creek and arrange for the money to be wired for the stagecoach fare. Her mother, whose name was Nell Collins, and who had the same determined chin as her daughter and the same habit of clear-eyed honesty, arrived in Harrow Creek on a September morning in 1882, stepping off the stagecoach with a single large trunk and a traveling bag and the expression of a woman who had decided to find this new country interesting and intended to follow through on that decision. She took one look at Eva on the platform and said, "You look well, extremely well." "I am well," Eva said. "Come and meet Clyde." Nell Collins shook Clyde Keating's hand with the same firm grip her daughter had used in the land office in 1874, and studied him with the thorough assessment of a mother who had been waiting 7 years to make this evaluation in person, and then said, "Eva tells me you brought her books." "I did," he said. "She has always loved books," Nell said. "Her father was the same way." "I know," he said. "She has told me a great deal about her father." Nell nodded, apparently finding this answer satisfactory, and climbed into the wagon with a composure that suggested she had decided he was acceptable, which Clyde received with the quiet good humor he brought to most things. Nell's room was the downstairs room that had originally been Eva's when she first came to the ranch, the small room off the kitchen with the window looking toward the southern ridge, and she settled into it with the efficiency of a woman who has moved before and knows what matters. She became, within the first week, a fixture of the ranch kitchen in the afternoons, drinking coffee with Eva, and when weather permitted, sitting on the south porch in the sun, which the doctor in Harrow Creek said was good for her lungs, which had been the primary source of her winter difficulties. Daniel adored her immediately. Clara was more cautious in her affections, but came around by the second week, won over by the fact that Nell could tell stories, long elaborate stories full of characters and reversals and satisfying endings, which she dispensed in the evenings after supper like someone who had been saving them for exactly this audience. The ranch continued. The North herd was expanded as Hector had recommended and as Clyde had finally agreed, and it prospered. The kitchen garden continued to produce its unreasonable quantities of tomatoes and beans, and the extraordinary squash that no one could entirely explain. Pete and his Clara had a baby of their own, and Joe Calloway fell in love with the daughter of one of the Eastern homesteaders and was married in the spring church. And Silas continued to care for the horses with the devotion that had been his character's defining feature for as long as anyone at the Red Cedar could remember. Eva stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen in the early morning of a clear October day in 1882, with the coffee just made and the biscuits in the oven and the valley visible through the glass in all its autumn color. And she thought about the woman who had stood on that stagecoach step in September of 1874, and looked out at Harrow Creek with her chin up and her leg aching, and her whole future a question she did not know the answer to. She thought about that woman with tenderness rather than pity, because that woman had been doing what needed doing, had been reaching for the life she wanted with the body she had, and the courage she could summon, and the firm conviction that she was capable of more than anyone who had not seen her work would believe. That woman had been right. She had been exactly right. The biscuits were done. Clyde came down the stairs and into the kitchen with Daniel at his heels, and Clara still calling from upstairs that she could not find her other boot, and Nell appeared from her room off the kitchen with the unhurried composure of a woman who had decided mornings were a matter of principle, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary noise and warmth of a family beginning its day. Clyde stopped beside Eva at the stove and took his coffee from the mug she had ready, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said low, for just her, "Good morning," with the quality that word had acquired between them over the years, full of something that was not just greeting but ongoing gratitude, for the morning and for her in it, and for everything that the word stood at the beginning of. "Good morning," she said, and leaned briefly against his arm and went back to the biscuits, and the day of the Red Cedar Ranch opened before them in all its practical, abundant, irreplaceable, ordinary splendor. She never hid the limp again. There was no reason to. There had never been a reason to, which was the thing she now knew that she had not known at the beginning, that the people worth keeping in a life were the ones who saw the whole of it and found it, if not simple, then worth it. Worth the difficulty. Worth the complicated truth of a heel-drawn bone and 3 years of reinvention, and a stagecoach ride to a town she had never heard of, and an advertisement she had folded into a purse she kept close to her chest. Clyde had seen it on the first day, and it had changed nothing, and that had changed everything. And Eva Collins, who was Eva Keating now and would be for the rest of her days, walked through her life in the Nevada territory with the gait that was hers and always had been, unperformed, unguarded, entirely and completely her own. The valley held them. The red cedar held them. And the kitchen table, worn smooth now with years of coffee cups and elbows and honest conversation, held the shape of every night they had sat at it and said true things, which added up, by October of 1882, to something very large and very good and not yet finished. The story of two people who had found each other at the edge of a wide country and decided, with the kind of deliberate and permanent intention that both of them brought to everything that mattered, to stay.